I see a 6:05. For anyone who'd like to join in, they can. I'm sure they'll just jump in when they can. If you'd like to start up, I think we've got all of our participants here. Verby's here, Katie's here, Cliff is here, Hugh is here, and I'm here. So we can go ahead. Let me grab my book. It's just over here really fast. And I made sure to get a new battery in my computer so I wouldn't run. Had to detach from my charger, like happened last time with Crossing to Safety.
Hey, Aaron, before you start,
Sure.
Just want to, and I'm sure on behalf of everyone, just want to thank you guys for continuing this wonderful program throughout this these challenging times. Thank you very much.
Great.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thanks a bunch. And really, that should be Verby's victory lap, because without especially her organizing skills and her technological savvy, I don't know that this could have been pulled off. So
I won't take much credit for the technological savvy. I just play it by ear and hope.
Well, and you got a free Presbyterian sermon out of it, I hear.
Yeah.
Yes, that was good.
Is that what the first link went to? Is a Presbyterian church sermon?
And I have yet to figure out how that happened.
That's all right. I'm blaming a lot of things on COVID these days, Verby. You can't. But it sure is nice to see everybody. And listen, I got to say that we're already in, the early stages of discussion about Take 5 2022. God willing, we'll all be back on campus with our catered food and everything else. So, hang tight until next year, and we should have a whole 5-session season. That's our plan anyway. We'll see what Mother Nature has to say about it, but great to see you all. So with that, let's just go ahead. I think everybody here knows our participants: Verby, Katie, Hugh, and Cliff. And I'm mighty grateful to all four of them. And this time around, Hugh, especially to you for a bang-up presentation. Thanks a bunch.
That's good.
You're doing a great job of swaying my initial reading of this book, which wasn't all that charitable toward either Jean or Finney, I must admit. And I am really interested to hear what the rest of you think about these two, because I'm still not convinced of Finney's good points, but maybe I can be swayed over the course of this conversation. So, Hugh, I guess at this point we can kind of give you the room to sit back in your rocking chair and just listen to the rest of us pontificate.
I'm just gonna rock, man.
What's that?
I'm just gonna rock, man.
Okay. Cliff, since if you don't mind, oh, he's leaving me.
I'll be right back.
Oh, okay. All right. I was going to start with him for two reasons. The first is that he wasn't able to make it to the Crossing to Safety panel discussion, though he did give me some good remarks to read. And the second is because I've got a whole psych eval I want to hear about with these two main characters. And I'm hoping that somewhere in Cliff's remarks, there will be a little bit of a psychological profile of Finney and Jean. So if it's going to take him another second or two to get back, Katie, maybe we can start with you and your remarks, your thoughts.
Sure. You're not gonna like it. All right, true story, guys. I read a separate piece for the first time when it came out in 1960. My parents bought all the good new books, and one day it appeared in the house and I picked it up. I was about 14. Most of the books I read, as much as I may have enjoyed them, had little application to my own experience, but this one did. Enthralled, I read it over and over again. It addressed a concern that I'd had for years without ever formulating it explicitly: the origin and consequences of impulsive, reckless behavior in young people. That kind of behavior underlay much of the play that I engaged in with my friends. We were growing up in an expansive rural place that offered virtually unlimited scope for risk. a car town, a place on the Atlantic Ocean and bisected by a river, where kids stayed outdoors all day and where we could drive farm equipment legally at 14. We took risks all the time, climbing trees, climbing the water tower, shooting at bottles or targets nailed to trees, jumping off roofs and moving cars, taunting alligators and brush rattlesnakes, swinging on vines over the canals, driving speedboats against the breakers. But the scariest thing to me was when risk-taking combined with obscure subliminal bad motives, as it does in A Separate Peace. Gene doesn't jostle the tree limb because he suspects Finney is trying to sabotage his grades with constant distractions. He jostles it because he has just discovered that he isn't. Now, added to the inventory of Finney's irritating perfections is the most deflating one of all. Not only is Finney superior to Gene in strength, in grace, in sports, in leadership, and in inventiveness, but he is superior to him in character. These boys have been schooled in rivalry, but with Finney, it didn't take. Without any evidence, Gene imputes bad motives to Finney. Later, in the face of strong countervailing evidence, Finney will refuse to impute bad motives to him. Now he is magnanimous. When Gene resists another excursion, just don't come along, he says. If you're really good at something, you've got to be serious about that. Pal, you're going to study. The stark contrast between his own malice and Finney's generosity is too much for Gene. Characteristically, instead of feeling admiration, he feels resentment. He isn't, can never be, as good as Finney in the way that matters most. But he's a fellow who submerges his feelings, and so he doesn't know what he feels. All he knows is that he experiences a sudden urge to jostle the limb Finney is standing on. Such a little thing. So he does it, without pausing to examine his motives or consider the possible consequences. Yielding to a potentially disastrous impulse happens to many of us at one time or another, and the book's impact on me was so great precisely because it had just happened to me. I discovered the book shortly after a boating excursion in a lake with my friend Oscar, who had been required by his parents to bring along his annoying younger cousin who was about 12. The cousin chattered incessantly and pelted us with pebbles, and we longed to be rid of him. We were delighted when, after we rowed out a ways, he suddenly jumped out of the boat to take a swim. I looked at Oscar. Oscar looked at me. We rowed away fast. It was a big natural lake. The cousin panicked, swam after us, but soon we knew he could no longer see us. Oscar and I weren't talking or looking at each other. He just rowed. After a while, I got scared. It had been some time since we could see or hear the cousin. I yelled for Oscar to row back, and that broke the spell. We realized we'd gone too far, and he rowed like crazy. We reached the cousin after he had swallowed some water, but before he had gone under, and hauled him into the boat. I couldn't stop shaking for hours, and I never told anyone about the incident. For some reason, the cousin didn't either. What terrified me was the way we had both been transported beyond reason by sudden disproportionate anger at the boy for spoiling our good time. I remembered other times when kids had been hurt at play, and I had wondered whether it was really an accident. Like Gene, I knew we had done a dangerous thing, impulsively, but if we were honest, on purpose. Like Gene, we hadn't considered the consequences before acting. Like Gene, we felt that it wasn't really ourselves who had done it, but that we had been in some sense possessed. Like Gene, we discovered that there was something terrible within us. Once the book was in my hands, I read it again and again to find out what that was and how to master it. Gene never found those answers. He knew his own guilt and confessed it, but in the end, he was cowardly enough to accept Finney's exoneration. But still he knew. Like us, he didn't understand, but he knew. Is there, as Hughes suggested in his lecture, something in this that helps to explain war? So many wars have started because of essentially childish, magical thinking, a disproportionate reaction to an ill-considered impulse, a cherished fantasy about the outcome. Would Gavrilo Princip have shot the Archduke Ferdinand if he'd stopped to consider that 20 million people might die? Would Yamamoto have made the decision to bomb Pearl Harbor if he had first considered the terrible loss and humiliation that might follow for his country? War is not a natural disaster. It has its origin in the minds of men. Montaigne wrote, "The same reason that makes us bicker with a neighbor creates the war between princes." We all know about the playing fields of Eton. In a separate piece, we're shown the big war outside the school and the little wars inside. Are we meant to make the connection?
Thanks a bunch, Katie.
Pardon me?
Thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you.
That's good.
If you don't mind, maybe I'll jump in a little bit on that question you asked. Are we meant to make the connection? Certainly the war is not just a backdrop, but it is this intrusive presence, and it really kind of comes to a head with Lepper when he enlists and then is released on a Section 8, much to his embarrassment and demoralization. My reading with this, my problem with the reading of the, what am I trying to say here? I guess my problem with Finney, I agree that he's not malignant, but I feel like he's a bit of a narcissist. And Cliff, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe a friendly narcissist, but somebody who has this kind of magnetism that in and of itself may not necessarily be so bad. The alpha male is nothing without his beta males. And I think this is where my reading is a little on the sinister side. I'm not sure how to read Finney. I think I'm going to need to read this novel again. I should have read it in high school when my other, my friends were reading it in their classes. For some reason, I just missed it. So I'm reading it the first time around here. And while I'm still not sure about how charitable or how mean Finney is, what does concern me, of course, is Gene. I think he concerns us all because Gene seems to me to be that beta male, that, the follower. Yeah, he feels that sense of rivalry, but when I think of Finney being jostled off that tree limb, I think of it because Gene is mainly mad at himself. And mad at himself, yeah, maybe because he misapprehended Finney to some extent, but more than anything, I see it as because he's just in this battle with himself of being a follower and then being repulsed by himself that he follows. And back to what you were asking about the war, Katie, and World War II is the best example that I can think of these cults of personalities that, whether it's Mussolini or whether it's Hitler, that these cults of personalities boiled over into, worldwide conflicts. And for me, that was that kind of, there's something that just set me on edge about Finney. At one point when they're playing blitzball, of course, blitz is such a loaded word for the time period we're talking about. And he says, let me see if I can find this really quickly. Everybody's against everybody else or something along those lines. And Finney just seemed to have this ability to, let me see if I can, I'm sorry, page 38. Just a quick line. But he seems to have this ability not only to draw people to him, but also to set people against each other, even if only in play like blitzball. Again, he can only do so much. His magnetism can only do so much before it then is the part of the beta males to do their part. And that's what's always scared me. Alpha males have always scared me, but beta males actually scare me more than alpha males.
You just don't like guys.
Alpha male, what's that, Katie?
You just don't like guys.
I guess not. But to me, when Gene jostles that branch, he's jostling a part of himself that is attracted to Finney, that calls him his best friend. And then is angry when Finney gets him into different dilemmas, whether it's, skipping out on studying for an exam, things like that. But really, he's angry with himself about these kinds of issues. And so I don't know, maybe I'm still not sure I'm sold on Finney as a free spirit. I think sometimes his free spiritedness revolves around the ability to get other people to kind of conform to him. And that to me is an iffy position. But Cliff, I'd like to hear from you on this now that you're back.
Well, I read this book shortly after it came out. I was in England at the time, and that was my first heavy exposure to, I was in an all-male college at Oxford, and most of my fellow classmates had gone to boarding school from age 8 or 10 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And I listened in amazement to the way that those societies were organized. And invariably there was a Finney or two who really called the shots. It struck me as a very cruel environment. And I don't know how many lepers there were along the way. Pay attention to that name. How many untouchables there were along the way who were sacrificed to a very cruel system. I was just amazed at the hazing, at all that would take place after lights were out, and the college or the school tutors and masters had taken off their academic gowns and were settling down with a glass of port. And then I skipped ahead to, I was at a basic training center for 2 years, from 68 to 70. And the number of Section 8s, that again hit me with all of the lepers that I saw. Many of the Section 8 people were draftees, and they just had a complete psychological collapse with, and it was going to put a blight on their records, on their employability forever. So with the reread of A Separate Peace, I felt like I was on an archaeologic dig, going back to those very first insights into the malignant aspects of an all-male boarding school on one hand. And I think there would probably be 2 or 3 Finney types acting as rivals with gangs, if you will, with followers of each one of them. And then we skip ahead to leper, and that tragedy of trying to shoehorn a person who is just psychologically very frail into the rigors of a basic training format. The thing I really appreciate about the novel, though, is it's written as if you are seeing it each page along the way from the standpoint of one of the boys. It's not written so much from the adult looking back. I think Knowles really succeeds in creating you feel you're there. You're looking at Finney through his contemporaries' eyes. I think he's a thoroughly deplorable person. I bet most of us have encountered a Finney or two along the way, and they can be very dangerous.
Cliff, I'm so glad you may have been gone for half of my remarks, but I'm not sold on Finney whatsoever. So thank you. I'm glad that you're even more. you're farther on the anti-Finney bandwagon, deeper into it than I am, but I'm okay with that.
I loathe Finney. I think he's a deplorable, dangerous person who in later life, if he's not handicapped too badly by his fractured leg, by his gimpy leg, is going to end up in politics with a group of troll-like followers. And you can draw from that any implication you wish.
You know, I grew up in New York, and I went to an all-boys high school, and this was in the late 1940s. And there were Finney types that were broken up along racial and ethnic lines. Part of the school was Irish, part Italian, part Jewish, and part Black. And there were Finneys in each of those groups, and you could identify them, you know, very easily. I mean, I could almost go back to my yearbook and pick those guys out. And it was cruel, Cliff. It was cruel.
Verby, how about
Would there be Finney types in all girls schools? Would there be Finney types? We never talk about alpha females, do we?
There's a great movie that came out, oh gosh, it's almost about 20 years old now. It has Lindsay Lohan in it. Do you remember this movie? I think it's called Mean Girls.
Mean Girls.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it just takes place, I think, at the, your typical American public high school. But I think you see it from a girl's perspective, or a young woman's perspective, as a junior, senior, and it's pretty good. It's written by Tina Fey, who, a great comedian and a writer for Saturday Night Live for all those years. And it's very funny, but it's got a lot of insight into high school life, this time told through a girl's perspective, not a boy's, but yeah.
I'm going to take a slightly different twist. Not in defense of Finney, except to say that we never see into Finney's mind. We only get Finney as presented by Gene. And I think that's crucial to remember. And another thing is that Hugh talked about his, seem like I'm getting some feedback. Does somebody have an electronic device on?
Maybe be in the background.
Why don't you get everybody to mute? If they'll mute, then you will get rid of that.
It sounds like a radio or something in the background. Okay. All right. Hugh talked in his presentation about the importance of distinguishing between the narrator who's telling this final version of the story and the narrator at the time the events occur. And most of the story is supposedly narrated at the time they occur, and he does do a good job of making you feel there and getting you involved in it. But occasionally the older narrator comes in there. But the story begins with the older Gene, who's come back seemingly for the first time to face this place and these events which have had such a profound impact on his life. Early in the novel, then, Gene says, "Looking back now across 15 years, I could see with great clarity the fear I had lived in, which must mean that in the interval, I had succeeded in a very important undertaking. I must have made my escape from it." The question is, what was his fear and how did he make his escape of it? Gene goes on to say, "There were a couple of places now which I wanted to see. Both were fearful sights, and that was why I wanted to see them." Finally, after all these years, he apparently thinks he's ready to face his fears. Those places are, of course, the marble staircase where Finney took his final fall, and the tree where he took his first one. Gene goes first to the stairs and sees that they're the same as ever. And he says, "And I? Well, I naturally felt older. I began at that point the emotional examination to note how far my convalescence had gone. I was taller, bigger generally in relationship to these stairs. I had more money and success and security than in the days when specters seemed to go up and down them with me." Convalescence is a fascinating word. And he's apparently using this visit as a test to see how much he's convalesced, to see how near recovery he is. Mm-hmm. From the stairs, Gene walks toward the second place, the tree. Quote, "Everything at Devon slowly changed and slowly harmonized with what had gone before. So it was logical to hope that since the buildings and the deans and the curriculum could achieve this, I could achieve, perhaps unknowingly had already had achieved this growth and harmony myself. I would know more about that when I had seen the second place I had come to see." This tree then, that looms so large in his mind, he heads out to see. It's barely distinguishable from all the other trees along the bank. He has a difficult time finding it, but he finally identifies it, and he's surprised at how much smaller it seems that he remembered. Quote, "The tree was not only stripped by the cold season, it seemed weary from age, enfeebled, dry. I was thankful, very thankful I had seen it. So the more things remain the same, the more they change after all. Nothing endures, not a tree, not love, not even a death by violence. Changed, I headed back through the mud. I was drenched. Anybody could see it was time to come in out of the rain." Briefly then, let's think about what it was that Gene feared so. Gene's relationship with Finney goes through several stages. When Finney says to him that Gene is his best pal, Gene wonders why he can't respond with a similar statement. Fear stops him. And Gene begins to think that Finney envies him because of Gene's academic success. And he realizes he's been envious of Finney too, so he starts thinking of Finney as his rival. This makes him feel better. He says, "I sensed it like the sweat of relief when nausea passes away. I felt better. We were even after all, even in enmity. The deadly rival was on both sides after all." His sense of relief is short-lived, though, when Finney urges him, in a passage I think Katie talked about there, to stick with his studies, and Gene realizes that Finney had never envied him at all. This is a devastating realization for Gene. Quote, "Any fear I had ever had of the tree was nothing beside this. He had never been jealous of me for a second. Now I knew that there never was and never could have been any rivalry between us. I was not of the same quality as he. I couldn't stand this. It's Finney's goodness, and whether you think he's the good or not, in Gene's mind, he is. It's Finney's goodness, his innocence, that Gene cannot stand. It's fear that comes from the realization of the hatred within himself. That's what causes him to shake the tree. Gene finally comes to realize the truth in the final scene with Finney when he explains to Finney and to himself that he shook the tree because of, quote, "some ignorance inside me, some crazy thing inside me, something blind." Gene's story is, of course, a Bildungsroman, a rites of passage, an initiation story. It's a movement from awareness, from innocence to awareness, the shift from childhood to adulthood. The inscription on the First Academy building accurately reflects what has happened to Gene. Here, inner boys to become men. Gene's initiation is more traumatic than most, so his coming to grips with it has taken a long time, 15 years. But after the visit, he knows that he has changed. We go back to the early part of the story and think about it again. It says, he's trudged through the mud, and now it finally is, as he puts it, time to come in out of the rain.
That's great.
I think you keep that in mind, Gene has achieved his sense of understanding, sense of peace.
Thanks, Verby. We'll never know who Finney is. What's that?
I said, so a different take.
Yeah.
That was
You're
awesome.
right. We only know Finney from Gene's perspective. I think for Gene to feel this this arrival, Finney has to be the person that he is, whether he really was or not. Again, we don't know, but Finney has to be the kind of saintly figure that he appears by the end of the novel for Gene to be where he is by the end, psychologically, emotionally speaking. So, these are great defenses of Finney. I just,
yeah, I'm not really defending Finney. He's probably more of a prop.
Yeah.
than anything else, you know, in the novel, in a sense.
Right, right.
Because it's what Finney, I mean, it's what Gene thinks he is that counts.
Right, right. Hugh, I'd like to hear any thoughts now that you've heard 4 panelists, and let's open it up to the rest of the participants.
I find it interesting that you and Cliff and Irv really don't like Finney. Maybe it's the beta male in me who's used to following alpha males. But, there's a, well, first of all, I really, Finney is not well drawn. I think that, I mean, he's pretty well a flat character. They're, I think, pretty well a static character. I don't think there's any growth in Finney, that we don't see it in the novel.
Yeah.
I wonder if maybe we could apply the word foil to Finney as Gene's foil throughout the novel in Gene's own mind, because he keeps setting him up as an opposite. What I wanted Cliff to talk about was whether these are just 2 sides of one personality. And I think I read an article or 2 that sort of suggested that these really, I mean, that Gene and Finney together make one whole human being. And so if anything, maybe the growth, if there is growth, and Gene is the realization that he and Finney are in fact one, and they both have the same dark side.
Yeah.
Don't know.
Cliff, turn your mic on, Cliff.
Be sure to get your mic on, yeah.
I really don't go along with 2 sides, well, 2 different sides of the same coin. I just see Finney as a malignant manipulator of people, and maybe my own experience in growing up where there were Finneys around, that I just immediately go into kind of a defensive mode. Finney represents almost a form of evil. I know that sounds extreme, and from my vantage point, and there are they can create havoc. They create fear. They also cause people maybe to poke at them occasionally, and in this case, the poke was the jiggling of a tree limb. Rereading it, maybe I was unearthing too many corpses from my own boyhood, but there were Finneys around my grammar school, middle school, junior high school. They were in college, and they're dangerous people to be around. There's something that can be switched on and off in our psyches by a lot of exposure to a dominant personality such as a Finney. They can make you question your own common sense, your own traditions, your own moral structures. And perhaps I need to read this book in the company of a psychotherapist.
I really liked Katie's of her and her cousin and the friend, cousin and Katie reacting the same way to the bothersome friend. He jumps in, let's leave him. It's just, yes, it's malicious, but it's not malicious. And the realization later, of course, that they could go back and get him, they hoped.
Herbie, at the top of page 101, I think he makes your point. You know, he says, there was always something deadly lurking in anything I wanted. And he said, if it wasn't there, for example, with Phineas, then I put it there myself. That was interesting. From what you said, I thought.
That's a good quote. I missed that. That's a good quote.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the thing with the war as a background, and that tendency at one point, which was a tendency you know, of a lot of soldiers and everything to blame the old men, the leaders, the people got us in this. And what Jean realizes, it's just within each one of us. It's there. We can't blame the outside forces. It's in us.
I think it's worth noticing that Finney, unlike a lot of those alpha males, unlike those leaders in war, never uses compulsion, never insists. That's important, I think.
I agree, Katie, and that's what makes him such a compelling character, or so fascinating. You know, every once in a while I'll teach a novel or a poem or something that has Satan in it. And Faust, or, you know, Paradise Lost. And the more compelling depictions of Satan are those that have him just offering choices. And it's the, you know, the devil with the deal with the devil. Well, you don't have to take those choices. It's the beta males who acting the way that they do to Finney's magnetism that is the real danger. And that's what I meant by saying it's always the beta males who scare me more than the alpha males. Because the really smart ones, yeah, will just offer choices. You can come with me, you can not. And I got to admit, that's why I kind of like Lepper so much, is that he seemed to, I don't know, intuitively sniff out the alpha beta relationship, and he would rather just go off and play at the beaver dam. You know what I mean? He knew somehow to just keep himself out of that world of dominance and conformity, which of course then is more heartbreaking when he gives himself over to the army and realizes that he can't conform, and that it crushes him from the inside. Susan, you were going to say something. Susan Russell?
I was just thinking of all my experience with children and having two boys, and one's an alpha, the other one didn't care, and watching them with their friends and how they look to one person to be the leader, and they always would ask him his advice. What should we do now? Where should we go? What should we do? And they were just like waiting for someone to take over. And in high school or any place, even in our little day camps, there was usually one person that was going to be the leader, and they looked around and decided it was going to be them, and everybody else would follow them. It's just part of what happens when people are in a group. Someone's going to assume the role of the leadership, and everybody else is going to follow him.
But there are good and bad leaders.
Right.
And leadership is a wonderful, necessary thing. I mean, I can think of so many leaders that I have admired and responded to in a good way and learned from. I don't think leadership itself or charisma or whatever you want to call it is a bad thing.
No.
And if it is, Finney is certainly adequately punished for it.
Yeah.
But who inflicts the punishment? Is the punishment simply fate?
I think it's Jean's objectification of Finney, to use a word that's often used of women. If Jean had not been able to objectify Finney, if he had not been able to dehumanize him in his mind, several people have spoken to that, then that he could not have done that. He could not have performed the act he did.
That's a good point. Any other thoughts? Any other insight into any of these folks?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Katie's original comments about youthful impulses struck home with me. That, I mean, we've all, I mean, hopefully it minimizes and curtails itself when one becomes an adult, but there are stupid impulses that we do when we're youthful. The other thing is, as I was reading this novel, I began to, it evolved with me that these are both flawed individuals, Jeannie and Finney, as we all are. None of us are perfect. And I was, at the time, I was more on Jean's side than Finney's, until there was a moment when I said, aha, this guy's just as bad in a different way. And it was when he went, when Lepper summoned him to his home at Christmas, when he returned from he got the telegram to come to the Christmas location. And then Lepper was pouring his heart out to him. And Jean said, and realizing this guy's only 18 years old or 17 or whatever age he is, he tells him to shut up. I'm reading on page 151. Softer, more timidly, he says, do you think I want to hear every gory detail? Shut up. I don't care. I don't care what happened to you, Lepper. I don't give a damn. Do you understand that? This has nothing to do with me. Nothing at all. I don't care. And that's what struck me. This has nothing to do with me. So I'm wondering, back to Verby's comment about pointing out the word convalescent in that opening chapter. Is that what he's convalescing from? His selfishness, his narcissism? Just wondering.
Is adolescence the state that we must convalesce from?
Some of us never make it.
I'm still working on it.
Yeah.
That's one reason it occurred to me. Excuse me. This book is so often used in high school, and I understand why, and I think that's very good. But I think you get a whole different perspective on it when you read it.
Yeah, I think I emailed you, Verby. My granddaughter, who's 14, up here at Signal Mountain Middle School, has this as her summer reading book for the 9th grade. They're doing The Hobbit, and they're doing Secret Life of Bees, and doing separate piece. And as we've been talking, I keep thinking, how would I approach it if I were teaching that age group? I usually taught seniors, so I was a little closer with some of you college professors are, as far as the way the level of thinking was a little bit higher. But how much experience does a 9th grader have to bring to this book?
Yeah. I think it can be very meaningful for them, but at the same time, I think it's sort of like Gene himself, the way he thought of it at the time it happened, and the way 15 years later he's thinking of it.
Well, if I had jiggled a tree limb and caused a guy to break his legs or whatever, I'd be thinking of it too. 15
Yeah.
Mhm.
Kathy, I'm thinking that a 14-year-old might understand this more acutely than we do, because these high schools are just full of lepers and Jeans and Finneys. I wish I'd read it back in high school. I read The Catcher in the Rye, and I know these two books are very different. You take away the boarding school aspect, and these are very different novels. But there were reasons when I read Catcher in the Rye for the very first time, I couldn't even explain to you why I liked it so much. I did, and I just sort of intuitively understood the world of Holden Caulfield and all these others. I suspect these 14, 15-year-olds are probably understanding the Lepers, the Finneys, and the Jeans, even in ways they may not be able to explain.
Well, it's on every list. When I taught in the middle school, I never saw it not on a list. It was separate piece was always included. So, they had their reasons, right?
Yeah. Well, and title, we haven't talked about the title much. That he says at one point we had created our separate piece. The world was on fire all around us, and yet we had, created our separate piece here, as if to suggest that at least for a while they're insulated from what goes on, insulated from larger historical goings on. But if you think about Jean's role in Finney's death, of course, jostling a tree alone won't do that, but the fall, that little kangaroo court that then makes him storm off at the end, which makes him slip on those stairs, which then presumably sets the bone marrow into a circulation by the time of the operation it kills him. It goes to show you how these one little ripples in history can have these larger concentric circles, these larger reverberations. And I was thinking of there's the famous mid-century philosopher Hannah Arendt, who talks about, individual complicity in history and how we like to think that in these larger worlds, we don't matter, what we do don't necessarily cause any ripples. But here's a good example of somebody who in one jostling of a tree, a half a second's action creates a whole set of ripples that eventually lead to somebody's death.
I think one of his points is there can be no separate peace.
Right. Nope.
That we're all connected. We can't be at peace while others are at war. And the school shows that itself. They're not at peace in that school.
No.
If he says they are, I think he's doing that to point us to the fact that they're not.
Yeah.
It to me, I think I mentioned it in the paper, it's a type of illusion.
Mm-hmm.
That there's several times in there he talks about that age 16 years old, and how everybody sort of looks on that at the time when peace would be. And I guess they're separate from the war, they're separate from adulthood, they're separate from childhood. And so, that's a piece of separate peace. And one of the things I was going to talk about, and I didn't in the discussion, and right now I'm blanking on the lines of defense that were set up.
Maginot Lines.
The Maginot Lines. And at one point, I think in the book, and I meant to write it down where he said each one of the boys had drawn his own Maginot Line.
That's at the very end of the book.
And I think each one of them in their own way. Lepers escape to the beaver pond. Lepers escape back to Vermont, from the army. Each one has their own separate escape, and it is a peace, quote unquote. To me, Jean's the only one that fights to try to find it, and I'm not sure that he ever does.
That's the last paragraph of the novel.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and read it.
All of them, all except Phineas, constructed at infinite cost to themselves these Maginot Lines against this enemy they thought they saw from across the frontier. This enemy who never attacked that way, if he ever attacked at all, if he was indeed the enemy.
Hugh, this was a great novel, and I'm grateful for your choosing it. As we start to wind down, I'd be interested to hear what the novels were that didn't make the cut. Did you have some in mind?
No, not really.
Well, for me, there was. I think he pretty well settled on this one. For me, I was looking at doing Sula, as our next novel, but we're doing a memoir instead for several reasons. But it would have been an interesting comparison to do Sula. I don't know how many of you have read Sula, but you have a similar thing happen in a way in which they're swinging a girl around. I mean, a little boy, the girls are swinging a little boy around, and he flies off into the river and drowns. And they never tell anybody. And that's really an interesting parallel for this story. But I chose instead to do the memoir, which you will find is a very different kind of reading. It's not as, I think, it's exciting to discuss in a way as the novel is, but I hope you'll find it worth your while to read.
It was a real trip back in time. My adulthood or young adulthood pretty much coincided with the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And that may be true for others as well. And it was a real time travel. I remembered all these things, which I hadn't thought of in a while, from a different perspective, the perspective of someone who's closely involved.
Yeah.
And it was remarkable how many memories that brought back.
I wanted to ask a question about the book that we read. It has to do with war. All the problems with the boys are universal, and they could have been in any setting, really, don't you think? You didn't have to have war to tell this story. So were they used as a metaphor for war rather than the book, war being used as a metaphor for them? Was it really about war and not the boys? Of course, it could be about both, but
to me, it worked. It showed it works on the same level individually as it does on the broad sense of war. You know, you think of all this evil with the war, but the evil is within the individual.
Even within war. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The one quote, I read this quote about humans create enemies for themselves and go to war against themselves. All those chattery things in your head you can't get rid of, or you have the guilt or something like that. We can't ever make peace with our past or peace with our mistakes or peace with, it's a lifelong struggle to have peace with any of those mistakes you think you made. And, 40 years ago, come on, it's time to let it go. But
that's a good quote, though.
So war is a metaphor for the war within ourselves.
Yes, and I think poor little guy was walking. He went back there to, I think, absolve himself. Just look at the tree and look at the stairs, and did I really do this? And maybe he can learn to live with it after that.
And
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Carol,
go ahead.
I'm done.
Well, I felt sorry for both Finney and Jean, really.
oh, I think they paid their prices. I mean, I didn't dislike Finney so much that I wanted him to.
If you're stupid enough to climb that tree, that's what you get, right? Is that what you're
Yeah. Another thought I had as I was reading this novel, and it appears in 1959. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
So assuming that it was published in 59 or right after, Frederick Buechner, who is no stranger to Chattanooga, was the chaplain at Phillips Exeter beginning in 1958 or 9.
Oh, really?
So he was there for 8 or 9 years, if my memory serves me correctly. If this novel was it popular at the beginning? I mean, would he have possibly had his students read this? Or it'd be great to have had him on this panel. for many reasons, but from that perspective as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't the author, didn't he go to a school like that? Is that what
No,
you're
he
talking
was
about?
at Phillips
He was
Exeter.
there.
Yeah.
He went there in he
Okay.
graduated in 1945 and then graduated from Yale in 1949. So he was at Phillips Exeter.
Mhm.
But this could have been any boys prep school
Right.
anywhere USA.
Right.
Could have been McCollin.
Yes.
Or Baylor. Or Sewanee Military Academy, where I attended as a day student, and day students were the outcasts because we weren't as cool as the boarders.
You were the lepers.
Yeah. Yeah. In many
We all
ways.
know that, you know that Prince Charles was in a school like this and
Mhm.
suffered terribly and
Right.
begged the Queen and begged the Prince Philip to please don't make me go back. And his daddy wanted him to have a tough life. He thought it'd be good for him, so sent him back. So his whole adolescence was so difficult because he was so bullied as
Yeah.
the prince,
Yeah. Well, guys, our hour's up. I'll let you get off to your dinner engagements or your episodes of Jeopardy or whatever it is you're going to do. Amanda's got something cooking in the kitchen. It smells delicious, so I think I'm going to go to it.
Yay.
But listen, I want to thank you again for showing up. This is great. And
Thank
again,
y'all.
Verby, thanks to you
Thank
for
you.
being the kind of controlling force behind this. Hugh, thanks for an excellent presentation.
Right. It was great.
So again, oh gosh, sorry, I'm running low on light here. YouTube presentation should be available by March 16th.
Right.
And on the 30th, we'll hold our conversation like this one for Marian Wright Edelman's Lanterns. So I hope you join us for both of those. And, let's hope that we get COVID under control. So by this time next year,
Mhm.
meeting in person to discuss a
Right.
whole 5-session season.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
all.